We got to hear just part, of that wonderful and famous 11th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews. That's more popularly known simply as the faith chapter for obvious reasons. And it begins with that beautifully poetic definition of faith. Faith, the writer says, is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That has such a beautiful ring to the ears, and it is so engaging with the mind when you think about that. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. In an age which constantly teaches us the importance of self-assurance, the letter to the Hebrews teaches us the importance of God assurance. Now, many people are often trying to see faith and science as opposites, at war with one another. Science being based in measurable truth and faith on blind acceptance. But the reality is that both faith and science have their foundation in the same place. They're both based on human experience. Science, through human experience, assumes that certain physical laws are reliable and will remain constant. Faith assumes that the human experience of God is reliable and will remain constant. And this conviction of things not seen that faith holds up goes all the way back to the beginning of everything. But not in the way that many fundamentalist Christians might think. You know, how sad this constant debate between creationists and scientists over the origins of the universe. And in my opinion, it's such a waste of time. Science attempts to describe, to go into detail about what happened and when it happened and in what way it happened. None of those are the concerns of faith. And in fact, those who bastardize it, who try to make faith so mundane. No, faith is not concerned with the details of what happened and when it happened and in what way it happened. If that were the case, all of the resurrection accounts would agree in every detail, and they don't, let me tell you. That's not what faith is looking for. Faith is asking, how did that come about to happen? In other words, why did it happen? And what was the purpose of it happening? So science continues to unfold and to enlighten our understanding of, say, like the Big Bang. They're still discovering about this expanding universe and how it started. But science doesn't answer why there was a Big Bang. What brought it about in terms of purpose? What is its purpose? Why is anything here? Those are the questions of faith. And the writer to the letter to the Hebrews has nothing, therefore, to say about what goes into our children's textbooks. What does he say? By faith, we understand that the worlds, that's an interesting thing, were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. And I don't think science can prove that wrong. So once he has set our very existence, all of existence, in the context of this faith in God, then the writer goes on to describe faith history as incarnated in the lives of God's special servants. Now, this writer, and I keep saying this writer, we don't know who wrote, it's often attributed to James, but we don't know who wrote this letter. But whoever it was, and it probably was a him, he was very familiar with the Bible stories. Very. Maybe we need some refresher. And this is when I get to play TV evangelist, because I brought my floppy Bible. He starts, there's a certain cachet here. He starts off with a story that we probably all rings a bell, Cain and Abel. But I'm not so sure we remember the details of that story as it was told in the 4th chapter of Genesis. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And God had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. God said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain then said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then God said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And this is one of the parts of the story we may remember and not know where it came from. Cain said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And God said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." Now, yes, this is the first story in the Bible about murder in the world. But that's the details of the story. What happened? When did it happen? How did it happen? Faith has a different question. And really, this story in that regard is a story about faith. Because Cain had no faith in God. Once God had such regard for Abel and his sacrifice, Cain saw no room for himself. And so he cut himself off from God. And once he did that, sin was indeed lurking at the door. The old translation says crouching at the door. Either one, lurking or crouching. And so even today, Abel's blood cries out from faith in God's love and acceptance. And Abel, therefore, is a prototype of all those through eons of time who have suffered and perhaps even given their lives witnessing to God's love and acceptance in their life and in others. So, we next remember Enoch, right? Oh, yeah, right. Who remembers Enoch? Nobody here. Enoch is only mentioned in a verse or two in the next chapter of Genesis, chapter 5, and it's mostly about his age. Probably, if any of us know anything, we know his son, because he's reported to be the oldest living person in the Bible. It says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, I feel for him, he became the father of, anybody know? You do know Enoch, Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enoch were, 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. And commentators say that this writer was very taken by the fact that Enoch walked with God and saw that as a sign of faith. And it dawned on me that perhaps it was this story, this verse, that influenced eons later the prophet Micah. that wrote that very famous verse that we've been basing our yearly focus on for the last couple of years, Micah 6:8. What does God require but that you do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God? It's a sign of being in relationship with God, of bringing pleasure to God, and of receiving pleasure from God. And so Enoch, too, is a prototype of people that we have known in our own lives. They don't have to be perfect, but when we look at them, we say, there's somebody who walks with God. The next, our attention is drawn to someone that we probably, many of us know the story from childhood, the story of Noah, who indeed was someone who had conviction of things not seen because it hadn't even started raining. God predicted the flood to him and commanded him to build an ark to save his family. And so Noah starts, and of course, he's the laughingstock of the neighborhood. The people all around him just think he's an idiot, and they ridicule him. And so not only can we be edified in our faith by this story of Noah, but of all the people in our own age who witness to the conviction of truth and God's commands, even in the face of public ridicule. And we love to talk about the negativity of the news and everything, but think of the people that remain true to that faith in God. I think of the one that comes to my mind is the deceased Senator John Lewis, who sacrificed so much through the civil rights movement and always stayed true to that conviction of things not seen. And so he edifies us in our faith journey. And then the last character that we hear about in this reading is Abraham. And Abraham's often considered the father of faith, the paradigm of faith. And so it would behoove us to really know his story. And of course it goes forever, but I want to read you the pertinent part for today. It says, God said to Abram, go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So Abraham went as God had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. And when they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. And then God appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Eternal who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Eternal and invoked the name of God. And so knowing that background, we can understand Abram became called Abraham. Abraham's frustration in that first reading we heard over God, he knew this promise of land and progeny, and yet he says to God, how is this going to be? Sarah and I are old as the hills. I ain't having any children, and the only child in this household is the son of a slave woman. And God takes him outside and says, look up at the sky, count the stars, if you're able to count them. And God simply says, so shall your descendants be. And Abram, it says, believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. That's faith. That's the assurance of things hoped for. The conviction of things not seen. And so Abraham also brings to mind countless people through the ages that have had this conviction. He's not the only one. People who've been willing to venture forth into the new and the unknown only because they rely on the one who promises. And it also reminds me of times in my own life when I have stared up at a star-spangled sky and realized the promised love of God, knowing it to be real in my life, and yet having no idea where it would take me. You know, I'm so edified when I see parts of my own faith journey echoed in the lives of those who came before me. And this, I think, is what the writer to the letter of the Hebrews is so masterful at. He makes the biblical stories part of our stories. And it makes our stories part of the biblical stories. This is all a journey. And we only heard the first part of that 11th chapter. It goes on, all kind of men and women throughout the Bible who have lived these lives of faith and given us examples. Some of them, I think, oh, I could never do that. Others, it really relates to the struggles in my own life. And then that reminds me of people long past the Bible that have done the same. People like Thomas à Becket in the Middle Ages, or Oscar Romero in El Salvador in the 1980s, speaking out for the poor and being murdered for it. Or in our own country, Martin Luther King Jr., having the dream, the assurance of things hoped for. All of these people had that assurance and that conviction of things not seen. And that brings us to the people in our own lives. People we know, who we've seen offer acceptable sacrifices. People who have walked with God, who have been willing to stay true to their convictions even in the face of ridicule. And people who've been willing to go out into the unknown or uncharted territories, simply relying on the one who makes the promise. We are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses who had this assurance and this conviction, but they also had one other thing in common. They all were dressed for action and had their lamps lit, just like we heard in that gospel reading. Because if faith could be said to be an inward and spiritual grace, then the outward and visible sign of faith must be readiness. Readiness for the bridegroom is how we live this life of faith within us. So, the great cloud of witnesses, both of those who came before us and those who are sitting beside us in the pews, or whose faces we're seeing on the screen, or names. We are all part of this together. So let us encourage one another to deepen our life of faith. And let us join together with all those who have come before us and seek a better country. That is, a heavenly